Hello legal hustlers. In this video we will see a brief overview of the administration of the East India Company in India and its exploitative policies, which led to the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the First War of Indian Independence. The East India Company's administration of India from 1757 to 1857. The East India Company was a British trading company that operated in the Indian subcontinent and surrounding areas from the early 17th century until the mid-19th century. It was founded in 1600 by a group of London merchants who were granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I to trade with Asia. The East India Company gradually became involved in Indian politics, and its influence grew as it gained control over various regions and territories. It eventually became the de facto ruler of much of India, and its actions led to significant political and economic changes in the region. In the 19th century, the East India Company came under increased scrutiny and criticism from the British public, particularly due to its involvement in the opium trade with China. The company's actions eventually led to the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which marked the beginning of the end of the company's rule in India. In 1858, the British Crown assumed direct control over India, and the East India Company was dissolved. Today, the East India Company is primarily known for its role in India's colonial history and the significant impact it had on the region's development and culture. The East India Company's administration of India from 1757 to 1857 was marked by the consolidation of British power and the establishment of a colonial government. The company controlled vast territories in India through its military and economic might, and its administration was characterized by a complex system of governance that included the collection of taxes, the maintenance of law and order, and the implementation of British policies. The administration was often exploitative and oppressive, and it played a key role in the exploitation of India's resources and the subjugation of its people. The period ended with the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which led to the end of the East India Company's rule and the beginning of direct British rule in India. Legislative Acts. Regulating Act of 1773 was passed by the British Parliament in 1773 to regulate the governance of British India. It created a Supreme Court in Calcutta, which had the power to try British subjects for crimes committed in India. It also established a Governor-General of Bengal to oversee all British territories in India. The act was significant because it marked the beginning of British efforts to centralize and regulate their administration in India. Charter Acts from 1773 to 1853. Charter Act of 1793. This act granted the British East India Company a new charter for a further 20 years. It also introduced the provision of open competition for the Indian civil service, which allowed Indians to compete with British candidates for jobs in the civil service. The act was significant because it represented the first major reform of the East India Company's administration, paving the way for further reforms in the future. Charter Act of 1813. This act renewed the East India Company's charter for another 20 years but with significant changes. It abolished the East India Company's trade monopoly in India, allowing private British citizens to trade with India. The act also made provisions for the promotion of education and Christian missionaries in India. The act was significant because it marked the beginning of British efforts to reform Indian society, promoting Western education and Christianity. Charter Act of 1833. This act renewed the East India Company's charter for another 20 years and made significant changes to the company's administration. It abolished the East India Company's trading rights in India, making the company solely responsible for administration. The act also introduced the principle of open competition for recruitment to the civil service, which allowed Indians to enter higher ranks of the administration. The act was significant because it was the first time the British government had intervened in the administration of India. Charter Act of 1853. This act renewed the East India Company's charter for another 10 years and made significant changes to the company's administration. It abolished the Board of Control and Court of Directors, which had previously governed the company, and replaced them with a new Secretary of State for India in the British government. The act also introduced the principle of separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches of the government. The act was significant because it marked the beginning of direct British rule over India and the start of Indian participation in the legislative process. The Indian Rebellion of 1857. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was a major uprising against British colonial rule in India, caused by religious, social, economic, and political grievances. The rebellion began with the Sepoys' revolt in Meerut and spread quickly, capturing key cities before being defeated by the British after a year of fighting. The British response was brutal, with massacres and reprisals against Indian civilians. The rebellion led to the end of the East India Company's rule in India and marked a turning point in Indian history, leading to the rise of Indian nationalism and eventual independence from British colonial rule in 1947. Consequences of the rebellion. Queen's Proclamation. The Queen's Proclamation was issued by Queen Victoria in 1858 after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and it marked the end of the East India Company's rule in India and the establishment of direct British rule. It promised to respect the customs and traditions of the Indian people and protect their rights and interests, which was an attempt to win their trust and prevent further uprisings against British rule. The proclamation had significant political and social significance and established the principle of religious tolerance in India. It had a lasting impact on the country's development and played a role in shaping the future of India. Act for the Better Government of India, 1858. The Act for the Better Government of India, 1858 was passed by the British Parliament after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. It transferred the power to govern India from the British East India Company to the British Crown and established a centralised administration with the Secretary of State for India as its head. The Act had significant political and administrative significance and helped modernise the Indian economy and legal system. It paved the way for several reforms, including the establishment of a modern education system, the introduction of modern infrastructure, and the expansion of trade and commerce in India. The Act had a lasting impact on the development of India and was a significant step towards India's eventual independence from British rule. Indian Councils Act of 1861. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 was a British law that aimed to increase Indian representation in the government by expanding the legislative councils in India. The Act allowed for more Indians to be appointed to the councils and gave them limited power to discuss and debate issues. However, the British still maintained ultimate control and authority over the country, as the Viceroy and Governor-General had the power to veto any decisions made by the councils. The Act marked an important step towards greater Indian participation in the government, but fell short of granting true self-governance. Reflection on the impact of British colonial rule in India. The impact of British colonial rule in India was both significant and far-reaching. On the one hand, the British introduced modern institutions, such as railroads, telegraphs, and a modern education system, which helped to create a more interconnected and prosperous society. They also helped to modernize India's economy, introducing new industries and promoting trade. However, the British also exploited India's resources, land, and labor to enrich themselves and their own economy. They imposed discriminatory policies and practices that favored British interests over those of the Indian people. For example, the British levied heavy taxes on Indian peasants, leading to widespread poverty and economic hardship. They also exploited India's natural resources, leading to environmental degradation and resource depletion. Overall, the legacy of British colonial rule in India is complex and multifaceted. While there were some positive aspects to British rule, such as modernization and economic development, the negative impacts of exploitation, discrimination, and cultural suppression cannot be ignored. Thank you for watching. We're thrilled to have you here and hope that you find our content informative, engaging, and entertaining. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to join us for further updates.